This is a tough one for me because I feel as though I'm looking into the lion's mouth, maybe sticking my head in. But it's not that I'm afraid to do this, obviously. Nobody's making me do it. But I thought of the 14th chapter of Romans as I was considering this particular video. In that chapter, Paul says that he's talking about eating forbidden food and taking certain holidays as more holy than others. And he says that if you're eating a food that you regard as, or abstaining from eating a certain food that you regard as part of your duty to God, then God accepts that as a service to him. If you're not bound, as you in your heart consider matters, by a restriction against a certain food, then that too is an offering that God accepts. God has set you free to eat whatever you wish. Same thing for observing certain days. If you observe a day as holy and you interrupt your normal activities, then that's offered to God. Every day that God has created is the same as every other day, however, and God understands that as well. So it's an interesting, almost a unique kind of chapter in sacred Christian texts. I don't want to be one of these who causes someone to stumble by calling into question one of the most, probably the central formula in all of Christianity. So what I'm about to say is not intended to mock, deride, otherwise undermine people's faith. Heaven forbid. It's not at all what I want. But I do want to talk about this because I feel that there may be other people who have been impeded by this formula from coming to Christianity in particular. But, you know, this is a formula that you also find in Judaism. It's not so central. But it's the Father sacrificing his Son kind of formula. Of course, in the Old Testament we have Abraham told by the angel that he is to sacrifice his son to God, Isaac to God. And Abraham dutifully obeys, except that his hand is stayed at the last possible moment because God is satisfied that he would have followed through and actually sacrificed his son, slit his son's throat on the altar that they had built together. So obedient is he to God that he will even slay his own son. And God is satisfied with that. Of course, this is... What can I say? I remember I really needed the job a few years back. We were in a new city and I was unemployed. I went to a religious fundamentalist institution offering to teach ancient Greek and Latin. So it's not as though I was offering I wasn't applying to teach theology or anything, but I gave them some stuff that I had written because I wanted them to know how I felt about things. I wasn't trying to cover up who I am or what I believe. Their response was basically, well, if you change your mind about these things, get back to us. So they were okay as Christians that I didn't have a job and my family needed an income, but because I wasn't right on certain literalist views of the Bible, and they regarded the Bible pretty much as a science textbook, then I could just go cool my heels somewhere until I got hungry enough to come back and say, you know what, I've thought this over and I'm with you guys. I don't get that mentality, and I have to look at things with in the light of what I know about the past. I know that ancient peoples, they were more tribal. and we are. I know that people today, I know that human beings, all human beings, have this kind of Dionysian side in them. This is why they get so stirred up at football games. In that same city, I remember there was a Friday night when the whole cheerleading squad had to be rushed to the emergency room because of mass hysteria. I guess the team was losing pretty badly, but strange things can happen when you have a group of people and their emotions are bouncing off of each other, and they get very wound up, and they believe in the irrational. The irrational has a grip upon our minds. I say they instead of me because there's something left out of me, I guess. I've never been susceptible very much to this kind of thing. I don't like the irrational. I've studied myth all of my professional life, and it fascinates me, but it doesn't particularly grip me as something true at the surface level. I have to pull up the hood and look into it before I can discover the deeper meaning. And I can do that with the Son and the Father, and I will do it if I'm not too long here. I'm kind of rambling. Let me give you just a few more examples of, in ancient cultures, of course, besides the Abraham and Isaac story, we have Osiris, the story of Isis and Osiris that Jordan Peterson likes to talk about. There's a certain amount of scapegoating there. The scapegoat is a Greek ritual that was probably originally human sacrifice, where you pick out an individual who's regarded as undefiled. When it was transferred to the sacrifice of an animal, they would pick a heifer or a goat or something that had no sort of maculation, that was perfectly white or perfectly black, and it was young, so it had not bred yet, and they would sacrifice that or drive it away from the pale of the community, which was the same as a death sentence. If you were a human being and you were exiled from the community, you would die of starvation in that sort of tribal circumstance. So this was the scapegoat was to take, as an innocent individual, was to take on its head the sins of the community, and that's why they would drive it away or execute it. For another year, perhaps, the community would be cleansed of that sin, that guilt which they had put on that individual. So this is really old stuff. There's even a couple of myths. The myth of Rustam and Sohrab in the Iranian Shahnameh. I used to teach that. Interestingly, that was written down within a few decades of an Irish version of the story where Cuchulainn slays his son Conley, and in both cases you have an extremely young son who comes looking for his father and doesn't actually know his father when he sees him. The father recognizes the son or doesn't recognize him until after he's slain him, but the father slays the son because the son is an outsider and he's regarded as an aggressor and a threat to the community. So the son must die to protect the community. And in both cases we could talk about kind of a sinless sacrifice. The boy is so young that he hasn't known woman at this point. He's a virgin male. And I get it at a certain level, at the mythic level. But here's the thing. There are a lot of things, aren't there? I mean, when does a father ever sacrifice his son because the son says, Dad, I know you're mad at these people and you have perfectly just cause to be so, but let me die for them. And the father says, okay, I got to kill somebody because I'm so mad. I'll take you. See, I said I didn't want to, I'm trying to mock or deride the central formula of the Christian faith, but I can't believe it at that level. And even theologically, that God is Jesus. Jesus is God, and both are the Holy Spirit. There's only one God here. I have a son, and he's the most valuable thing to me on earth, but he's not me. I mean, the trying to project my relationship with him onto God in the two persons, God the Father and God the Son, it makes no sense to me. It doesn't help me at all. It just confuses things. Let me just, since I do have to wrap this up, so let me offer a couple of things. I'll start with Abraham and Isaac first of all. And this was something that just occurred to me as I was writing a book last year. And I had always been very disturbed by that part of Genesis, and I could not accept that as a story of obedience. I would think that God would kind of be hoping that Abraham would say, "I'll do anything for you. I'll kill myself, but my son, I can't. I mean, not because I refuse to, because I'm not obedient to you, but because it's wrong, and you're all good. And how can I worship God all good by doing something that's this atrocious?" And then it occurred to me to exegese, to open up this story so that it's more valuable. Imagine that I lose my son, God forbid, that I have to live out my remaining years on earth childless. And I hardly think I could stand that, but I have to, because it could happen. And in that sense, I have to be like Abraham. My faith has to be such that it doesn't depend on my son's living this life longer than I do. And the ancient Greeks, too, agreed that the worst thing that can happen to a parent is to die after the child has died. Well, that happens sometimes. You know, there are a lot of reasons why it might happen. Does your faith in God depend on that? Because if it does, you're not in the right place. So I've come to look at the Abraham and Isaac story as a challenge to me to truly trust in ultimate reality and not make my belief in that reality dependent upon something going well down here right now. That would not be very strong faith. And as far as the Father and the Son and the sacrifice of the Son so that the people can be redeemed, Jesus is God. But God is beyond, so far beyond our human comprehension. God so loved us that he took our form, the form of a human being, so that we could see him in the flesh, so that he could walk among us and we could see how he behaves and hear him speak and learn from his teaching. What an incredible, you talk about a sacrifice, what an incredible sacrifice to be the creator and sustainer of the universe, the author of all goodness, and to squeeze yourself into this microscopic little human body. In doing that, God was somewhat confined by the human intelligence that he gave himself. And this is how I look at Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's praying to God that this cup may pass him by. Why would he do that if he's full God and he understands the full measure of things, the vast, complete truth of things? But he's still compressed in a human form, and he feels the anguish that a human being must feel. Of course, at the end he says, "Thy will be done," and he accepts what must be. But that's the sort of acceptance, you see, we human beings, that models what we have to go through. That's why God became one of us, to model the sort of behavior that we should emulate. And the Holy Spirit, when we try to think of God but can't in his full majesty, and when we see God and read about him in the flesh as Jesus, some of us can make the connection. Oh, this is that. This is how this is how God projects into the world. And I think when we make that all-important step, it's because the Spirit has built a bridge that makes that possible for us. But, some people don't. And there's a mystery there. And some people whom I have admired very much in my life have been unable to build that bridge. And I suppose I would explain the Holy Spirit as being that mystical, inexplicable bridge that brings us to understand that God comes to us through Jesus. Now, if you prefer to think of somebody dying an anguishing, horrible death, and he's completely innocent, and you're the guilty party, and you're just washed in that blood, and somehow that so just crumples you up inside and beats you down and then lifts you back up. It does something so emotionally complex to you that it allows you to believe. Then please cling to it, and please try not to understand what I've said as derision. But I can't believe that way. And I try to explain the way that I believe, and I'm hoping that my explanation perhaps has been a kind of bridge for others who may be watching this and who may have some of the difficulties that I have had. That's my hope.